Good morning. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, so welcome everyone to the second WRAC Forum. Appreciate everyone coming. This one is going to have a little bit more spice than the last one. I think we'll have some good discussion on the topics that we need to talk about. So thank you for coming. Just so everyone knows, we are webcast, and so that people can watch later, watch live, whatever's necessary, just so everyone has the benefit of this discussion. And as you speak, we'll go around the room in a bit, but as you speak, be sure to turn on your mic. And so when you see it turn green, or in my case, when Sean tells me it's green, then that's when you speak. But also, let me just say who you are as you speak, because that would be helpful for the webcast. So without further ado, let's go ahead and go around and do introductions again. I would like to point out that we do have a WRAC Recreation Forum also, and so I've asked Newton Cook if he could join our WRAC Forums as a resource from the recreation side of the house for WRAC discussion items. And while we take feedback from all the WRAC members, also public feedback is very important, so there will be comment portions in the agenda, and we certainly want to hear from others in attendance as well. So we'll just go around the table for introductions. We'll just go this way.
Good morning, Sean Cooley, Communications Director for the Water Management District.
Good morning, John Mitnick, Chief District Engineer, as well as the Assistant Executive Director here at the Water Management District.
Good morning, Jennifer Leeds. I serve as the Interim Division Director for the Ecosystem Restoration and Capital Projects Division.
Inger Hansen with Florida, the Department of Environmental Protection, Office of Water Policy and Ecosystems Restoration. Thanks.
Susan Goslin, Natural Resources Manager, Osceola County.
Good morning, Doug Gaston, Audubon, Florida.
Good morning, I'm James Evans, Director of Natural Resources for the City of Sanibel.
Good morning, James Erskine, Everglades Coordinator with Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission.
Good morning, Gene Duncan for the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians.
Good morning, Newton Cook, Facilitator for the Recreation Forum.
Good morning, Rebecca Elliott for the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, and not Angela Shillette. Unfortunately, Angela was not able to travel down yesterday to join us this morning, so you have me. Thanks.
Aubrey Arrington, Loxahatchee River District, and apologize for missing the last meeting.
Good morning, Lee Hefty, Director of Miami-Dade County's Division of Environmental Resources Management.
Good morning, Todd Heiche, representing the Southeast Florida Utilities Council.
Alex John, Seminole Tribe of Florida.
Good morning, I'm John Lai. I am the President and CEO of the Sanibel Captiva Chamber of Commerce.
Grant Lanham, Vice President, Environmental Safety and Security at the Sugarcane Growers Cooperative.
Charles LaPrade, Agricultural Manager, Miami-Dade County.
I'm Tom Van Lent here from the Everglades Foundation, sitting in for Jeff Mullins, who is on paternity leave. So when he comes back, he'll be sitting here next time.
I'm Ryan Orger, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation.
Good morning, Lieutenant Colonel Todd Polk. I'm the Deputy Commander for South Florida of the Jacksonville District of Engineers.
Good morning, Herb Rayborn, Manager of Environmental Permitting for Walt Disney.
Bonita Whalen, Water and Environmental Manager for the Florida Cattlemen's Association.
Yvette Bonilla, South Florida Water Management District.
Good morning, Jennifer Smith, Chief of Staff, Water Management District.
Is that green? Mm-hmm. All right. All right, thank you. So right now I think we got one agenda item essentially to have a lot of discussion on. I think at some point, Newton, it'd be good for you to give a report out on the Rec Forum meeting that was held last week. Why don't you go ahead and do that now? Not last week, last month.
Thank you, Drew. I will be giving a report on the most recent South Florida Water Management Recreation Forum meeting. Incidentally, the next meeting will be here in this room on Monday, March 16th at 5 o'clock. Everyone's always invited. Sometimes these meetings can be very crowded and interesting because if there's a problem somewhere out there, they tend to show up from all over the district. Sometimes they can be quiet, so hopefully we'll have a quiet meeting. The recreation meetings are held each quarter. These meetings began over 15 years ago to give the thousands of people who recreate on over 600,000 acres of district land from Orlando to the Tamiami Trail a place to solve all the problems and conflicts and suggest improvements. The stakeholders include hikers, bikers, hunters, anglers, boaters of all kinds, including airboats, campers, birders, horse riders, and my favorite group is the stargazers, who, believe it or not, come and make a presentation at least once a year to us. All these stakeholders attend the recreation meetings as issues come and go. Some meetings, as I said, will be crowded with horse riders. The next meeting will be full of airboaters. The next meeting will be you're going to close a canal somewhere, and we'll have a group that will show up. I don't have to tell you the spray issue is always a problem or an opportunity. They're all roundtable meetings. There is no 3-minute stop. Everybody gets a chance to make their case. Now, at the last meeting, which I'll just briefly go over, Jennifer Smith was there for the district, and we had an overview of the South Florida Trail Riders Organization. The treasurer of the South Florida Trail Riders was here, Augie, and these people ride the levees as much as they do more and more now. The levees are being opened to the horse riders, and it's very good. There's some tremendous trails the district has for the horse riders all over the district. Then we had an overview of the Angler Action Foundation from Brett Fitzgerald, Executive Director. This is a foundation where they're taking the information and data from people catching fish, and they're using this scientifically to help with the freshwater, particularly bass populations in the state. I don't have to tell you how much money in Florida is made from people coming here to fish for bass. Then we had the Palm Beach County Shooting Range, Bill Klein from the FWC. I always tell people I made my first, Bill called me about 2006 and said, Newton, I need you to go to Palm Beach County Commission and speak for this gun range. And what gun range? Well, he'd been working on it 10 years by then, and that thing is being built right today. Now, mind you, that's a long time, but that's what it takes to get things done out by Mecca Farms. It is going to be world class. It's an Olympic level gun range. What's good about it for the district is the district has a real problem of people target shooting all over the properties. And if you can get people who target shoot inside gun ranges, then we don't have a tragedy like we lost, a guy got shot fishing at S34, I think it was, SCA-34, and just fishing, and he got shot by a stray bullet. We don't want that. So this gun range has been very important. Then the state python removal program, we've all seen that on the news. Roy Feeney does a fantastic job here on land management, which we have a tremendous crew here on that. And he gave an overview of that program, which just came to an end just recently. Vegetation management in stormwater treatment areas from Leroy Rogers. That's dear to my heart because as a duck hunter, the stormwater treatment areas are a world. Actually, people come from all over to hunt ducks on the stormwater treatment areas here. They're just amazing. And we watch them very close. Public use projects update from Jerry Krentz, who's the land management staff here. There's always things going on. We have thousands of people, as I said here today, out on the government-owned property, district property right now. And there's stables, there's hiking paths, there's bike paths, there's boat ramps and all types of things that have to be maintained and kept, and Jerry's on that. Dan Cotter, who also is here, always talks about the updates. We have a big volunteer organization that helps the district. In this particular case, the Kissimmee River Valley Sportsmen Association. They have been installing public use shelters up in the wilds of the Kissimmee airboat country. It would cost the district thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and these people volunteer and build these shelters at their own expense. So it's a fantastic thing. And last but not least, we always talk about future agenda items, and I'm sure this will be coming up in a couple of weeks. And there's a boat ramps and also establishing alligator hunts on STA 1 East. So that's pretty well what the meeting was last time. And again, I invite everyone to show up, if you like, at our next meeting. Thank you.
Thanks, Newton. Well, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jennifer Leeds, who will basically give you an overview of our approach to aquifer storage and recovery, well rehabilitation and construction in the Lake Watershed. This is intended to be a dialogue, so as soon as, you know, if you have questions or if you have thoughts or anything, feel free to interrupt, and we'll just, you know, have a good discussion with respect to our approach here. So I appreciate it, Jennifer.
Good morning. So I'm going to, as Drew mentioned, I'm going to present a high-level overview of our aquifer storage and recovery well implementation. I also have Bob Verastra up here with me. He's our lead hydrogeologist on this effort, and he can also help to answer any technical discussions. So what we're really looking for today is to not only give you a high-level overview, but to also help facilitate, you know, a robust discussion, get your feedback, you know, really have some good conversations about it. So feel free, as I'm going through this, to interrupt me if you need to. Bob is here. He'll be up here with me, and we can answer any kind of questions, and then we'll kind of go from there and see where we land at the end of the day. So just kind of like what we're going to cover in this is we're going to give a little bit of background on aquifer storage and recovery, or what we call the ASR wells. We're going to talk about the locations of some of these wells and where we're looking to place them. We're also going to cover some of the recommendations that came out of the National Academy of Sciences review. Back during the CERT program, we had an ASR pilot project that we did in a regional study, and they reviewed those reports and they made recommendations on how you would go forward in implementing more of a larger scale program. So we want to tell you how we're incorporating those recommendations. And then also just the implementation of the wells under the Lake Okeechobee Watershed Restoration Plan. So this is a slide just kind of giving an overview on ASR wells in general. On the right side of the slide, we have like a graphic that it's a basic graphic, but it kind of shows some of the major elements of what an ASR well, you know, looks like. You've got, if I can get my mouse up, here we go. So we have the well here itself, but what we'd like to point out is these are situated in between what are known as confining layers within the aquifer. So you have one here and you have one below, and then like the opening or the screening of where the well is, where we would store the water, is between those confining layers. And so the confining layers are more of a clay-based kind of material, like a lot like Play-Doh. So there's not water that migrates through those confining layers. So where we're storing the water is kind of in between that, or that's the premise behind that. So what do? They store and recover volumes of water underground. These volumes of water can be stored through multiple years. It could be several months, or it could be 1 year. It's all depending on the situation, how much water you have flowing, where do you need it, or how do you want to recover it. Each of these wells can deliver about 15 acre-feet of treated water per day. These wells are what we call 5 million gallon per day wells, 5 MGD wells, and several wells make a cluster. So you'll hear that terminology as well, like a well cluster, and those are made up of different pairs, and we'll go into that in just a little bit. Additionally, from the work that we've done, from having some pilot projects and other studies, putting the water down into the wells appears to remove phosphorus. It can also temporarily liberate arsenic at startup, and this is all depending upon the geology down in the aquifer. And part of the monitoring program that goes along with that is we will be monitoring for, as we're putting water in the well and coming out, arsenic is one of those constituents that you monitor for. We also know they work in conjunction with reservoirs and STAs. So sometimes you'll hear the term that ASR wells can be co-located with an above-ground storage feature. And sometimes those above-ground storage features can act like a surge tank, and then you pull water in and out from there. And there's also limited land requirement for these. So when we say that, they have a very small footprint, maybe half an acre. So as we talk about how the district's going to move forward and implement some siting of some new wells, we're looking to keep that all within the right-of-way of our existing canals. So we don't anticipate any land acquisition associated with that. So next, we kind of want to talk a little bit about the differences between that an ASR well is not, it's not a disposal well, right? There's differences between the two. The graphic on the right shows that those two wells are at different depths. So on the right side, we have an ASR well, which goes to down roughly about 1,000 feet deep. And on the left of this graphic, we have a depiction of a disposal well, which goes down to 3,000 feet deep in this area that we call the boulder zone. And so one of the other differences between these two is when we put water down in a disposal well, you can't recover it. Where in an ASR well, depending on the geology and if it's properly sited, you have the ability to have a high rate of recovery. And some of this we've seen in some of the previous work we've done in the ASR pilot study, that depending on the geology will dictate how much water you can recover back out of the well. So this kind of reiterates some of the graphics we've seen before. It's just kind of an overview, a depiction of some of the hydrogeology of South Florida, and that the ASR wells that we're looking to put in are going to target the upper and middle zones within the Floridan aquifer. And so we've kind of circled those here in the map. So this is the upper Floridan, and this is the middle Floridan aquifer. And again, I'd like to point out these confining layers here. You see this Hawthorne confining zone. This is a confining layer here. There's another one that's in between the upper Floridan, and then we have one that's also below the middle Floridan. The middle Floridan is also called the Avon Park Permeable Zone, and you'll hear that terminology as well, so that's why I'm kind of throwing some of that out there for you. But again, to go back what we talked about earlier, these confining layers are clay-like material. And so you may have a well that's in the upper Floridan and then another one that's down into the middle Floridan. This is what we call a well pair, which is what we're looking to implement. But the water doesn't migrate between the two because of that clay-like material. Just kind of like a contrast to that, up here is the water table aquifer. This is where your like drinking wells are sunk in. They typically don't go down into the Florida. Some of the municipal wells may go down there, but this water down here is kind of brackish. Okay, so that's a little bit, a very high-level background on ASR well technology itself. Bob has a much more detailed history with that, so any questions on that, he's here to answer those. So, locations, and the locations that are associated with the Lake Okeechobee Watershed Restoration Project. So just really quickly, this restoration project, which is still in the planning phase, right, it has not been authorized by Congress yet, had three major components to it. It had this above-ground storage feature, which is this blue thing right here. It was called a wetland attenuation feature, shallow storage. Then we had the aquifer storage and recovery wells, and the locations of those wells are depicted by all these circles that you see on the map. And then the last part of it was they had a wetland restoration feature, which is the green things on the map. But what I'd like to talk to you about is the locations that we're looking at siting the wells are all north of the lake. We're also looking for locations that where most of the volume is coming into the lake, like down the Kissimmee River is where the lake gets its major inflows of water. So this is where we would look to initially site some of our exploratory wells to start. That gives us the ability to not only capture water as it's coming into the lake, but we can pull lake water back out because it's downstream of the last structure before it goes into the lake. And then also this area here north of the lake, up in the Taylor Creek area, L63N Canal. And the reason why we're looking up in there is we know we have some high phosphorus concentrations in the water up there, so we'd like to have a nice dispersion of, 2 different locations north of the lake where which we can start putting these exploratory wells in. So how do we intend to use these under the Lake Okeechobee Watershed Restoration Plan, and just really in general, how we talk about putting water into the wells and taking it out. And it has like a name that a terminology which they use. So when you put water into the well, they call it recharge, right? So it's recharging water, it's putting water down into the ground. And so, what it's meant to do is capture the water that would otherwise go into the lake. And again, those wells have the ability to pull water back out from the lake. So like we talked about on the other slide, that's the advantage of siting these just north of the lake, but in a location where they can interact with Lake Okeechobee. In addition, they provide the ability to store water underground. This also will help us manage high lake levels, so we can capture that water as it's coming in. Once the event has passed, if we still have water coming in, we can pull that water back off the lake. That will help us with those high lake levels. Those higher lake levels we know also hurt the lake ecology. So we're looking to kind of help keep the lake in that zone where that's beneficial for lake ecology. Also, some of those higher lake levels we know will lead to harmful estuary discharges. So having those sited north of the lake and having the ability to pull that water back out of the lake will help with the estuary discharges. Also during recharge, there is something that we call pre-treatment. So the water will be pre-treated to drinking water standards. And this is regulated by the underground injection control permitting process that's with DEP. So that's putting water in. So when you take water out, they call that recovery. So during recovery, this also gives us the ability to deliver water to the lake to help keep water in that ecologically preferred band. So if the lake, say, is getting very low, right, and we're starting to get close to water supply cutbacks, we can pull water out of the ASRs and put that into the lake, bring those lake levels back up to the ecologically preferred band. Also during recovery, the water is aerated as it's coming out of the well and before it goes into the receiving water. So before, say, it goes back into the canal or into Lake Okeechobee, we aerate that to bring the dissolved oxygen levels back up. So it's much better for the aquatic habitat that's there and the aquatic life. And we're also monitoring for water quality to meet surface water quality standards. In addition, during dry times, we can pull water back out from the ASR. It has the ability to do that, get it into Lake Okeechobee, and then provide fresh water to the estuaries during those extended dry periods. The Caloosahatchee has an MFL, and during drought times, we all know that we're always focused on looking and making sure that we have enough fresh water to provide for that, so this can also assist with that. And then last is it will also improves the water supply reliability to the existing legal users of the lake, because we all know there's existing legal users for Lake Okeechobee. So as you pull the water back out of the ASR and put that into the lake, it helps for all legal users of the lake. Okay, so we know under the Lake Okeechobee Watershed Restoration Project that planning project is proposing 80 ASR wells. That doesn't mean that we're going to go out tomorrow and put 80 holes in the ground, 80 wells in the ground. Right? Physically, we can't do that, but also we know that you need to be able to take it in a stepwise fashion, ensuring that as you're locating these wells, you're monitoring the aquifer for pressure, you're seeing how close they can be located, and it's not only important that you do that for implementing it in a phased approach and incorporating sound science, but for us on the designing side as well, that helps us determine, do we need to have one intake system? Is it 2 intake systems? What's the top pumping package look like? So we want to take that phased approach for sound science and also for smart design purposes. So to that, as we talked about a little earlier, the National Academy of Sciences reviewed the previous work that was done under SERP, the ASR pilot project, and also the regional study, and gave recommendations on how to implement on a large scale. So we are taking those recommendations incorporating that into our approach. Some of the recommendations they came up with are to phase it and do multi-well clusters. So that's where we get back to you have a pair of wells, and 10 of those wells makes a cluster, and they're in at 2 different levels within the aquifer. They also recommended that we look at something called longer and larger recharge and storage periods. So what does that mean? So when you put a well in and you start operating it, you do something called cycle testing. Cycle testing is you put water into the ground and you store it for certain periods of time and you bring it back up. So their recommendation was, okay, if you've done that for 6 months or 12 months or 18 months, start doing longer periods of that. So we'll incorporate that into the implementation as well. And then expanded ecological testing with some of the recovered water. So with those recommendations, we talked about some design considerations. You know, as you're putting it in, you know, what are some of the things that you need to consider in your design of these things? Also for us, you know, having a standard design as we're moving forward makes it more efficient and cost-effective on an O&M perspective. So we're looking at, you know, water treatment technologies that will meet the permit requirements and that we can just replicate as we move forward. Passive and low energy recovery. That's a really nice way to say it'll act like an artesian well. So maybe we pump in, but there's enough pressure within the aquifer that you know, artesian, it flows back out. Looking at the interaction between the upper Floridan and the middle Floridan. You know, when you have those 2 wells sunk in different aquifers, what are you looking for with respect to some of the pressure in there? You know, making sure that the spacing of it is functional as well. And then also coordinating with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission to address any potential impacts to aquatic life. So what this really means is, you know, there's fish larvae within the canals, making sure you have the proper screenings, and so those things don't get captured into the intake. So we're being very cognizant of that. With the National Academy of Sciences recommendation, we thought, you know, everyone has a lot of questions about this, about ASR well, how you're going to implement it, how are you implementing sound science. So we thought that a really good way to get at this and also to address stakeholder concerns and interact with stakeholders would be to create an independent external peer review panel that would assist us in addressing some of those National Resource Council comments. These would be people who are not within the Water Management District. They're external. They're experts in their field. And they would have the reports and the recommendations and then do like ongoing peer review as we're rolling this program out and as we're implementing. And again, we want to do this to help provide some assurance to stakeholders and the public that this program, and as we're moving forward in the stepwise fashion, is being implemented with sound science. This is an independent panel. They're recognized experts within their fields of hydrogeology, water chemistry, well technology, ecology. They're from various portions of the state. They'll review the past projects, the proposed activities, and they'll kind of work, you know, throughout the process. And they'll meet periodically, you know, as we come up with significant project milestones and activity. And just some of the people who we've reached out to who have expressed interest, this isn't the full panel, but these are the people who have said, yes, they're very interested in working with us, would be Dr. John Arthur, who's the state geologist for Florida. We've had discussions with Dr. Tom Frazier, who's now the state science officer, so he's interested. Dr. Renee Price with Florida International University, who is actually a former National Academy panel member. And then Dr. Sam Upchurch, who's retired. He was a geology department chair at the University of South Florida. So these are the people we've reached out for now to gauge their interest. They've said yes, they're very interested in doing this. And so we'll be moving forward with that, so you'll be hearing more about it. Okay, so we talked a little bit about some of the existing ASR facilities, and we talked about some new things. So the district has 2 existing ASR facilities, and they're in green here up on your map. It's the Kissimmee ASR CERT pilot project. We've talked a little bit about that before. And the other one up here is what we call the L63N. It's named that because it's sitting on the L63 canal. So with the Kissimmee CERT ASR pilot project, that was constructed and tested. It was functioning from 2009 to 2013. It's been sitting idle. And then with the L63N, it was constructed a long time ago, back in the 80s. It's been sitting idle since then. Both of these, we're looking at refurbishing these wells, getting them back up and functional again because we have them, they're existing. And then with the Kissimmee well, we talked about that during cycle testing and functioning of this well, it demonstrated a very high capacity to take water in and a high recovery capacity. And then the unique thing right now with the L63N is this is sunk a little bit deeper than the Kissimmee one, so we'll have some information going on with that. What I also want to call your attention to are the two new sites that we're looking at dropping in exploratory wells, and they're here with yellow stars. We have one here. This is right along the Kissimmee River. They're going to be referred to as a C38. That's the actual canal number for the Kissimmee River. It's right across from our existing SERP ASR pilot, and then a little further up, closer to Paradise Run. Throughout the entire time that we're looking at refurbishing these wells, we'll have the ongoing peer review process. We'll be working with them. And again, the advantages of having these two new locations is we can take water as it's coming into the lake, or we have the ability to pull the water back out of the lake. So, implementation. Where we go from here, you know, the Water Management District received funding in fiscal year 2020 to implement this. So this is just a high level of where we're at currently with our implementation. So year one, 2020, we just talked about both the L63N and the Kissimmee River ASR. These are our two existing ASR wells. They're both going to be going through the permitting process and refurbishment. At the same time, we're looking at the site locations for our two new exploratory wells to go in. These would be two new locations. It says the C38N and C38S well pairs. Again, that's right along the Kissimmee River. And those are currently in the design and the permitting process. Part of that design process is looking at like the site, right? Like what is there, the site evaluation, the constructability of that site. Do you have, you know, power infrastructure? Do we need to get power there? Looking at standardized design for these wells. A little bit earlier we talked about as we move forward with this program, you don't want to have different types of designs for your well, for your pumping packages, for your intake. To the extent that we can, we want to be able to have a standardized design, so that's more cost effective and that's less money that we have to spend on the O&M. And then for years 2 and 3, so fiscal years 21 and 22, we're looking at having both the existing ASRs up and functioning, cycle testing and operating, and then with our two new sites that we're looking in, construction of the wells, the design and permitting. We'll have construction of the pretreatment and the intake systems going on, and then start the cycle testing and operations. All throughout this time, we'll have the ongoing peer review process with our panel, and then we'll work closely with them and also to engage stakeholders to see how things are going. And Bob put this in here for you all, and this is a picture of one of the wells. So, on Marco Island picture. So with that, that's all I had. I see no one stopped me, but I saw a lot of furious writing. So I'm sure there's many questions and discussions, and hopefully this really facilitates a good, robust discussion today.
All right, just raise your hand if you have a question or a thought. Yeah, James.
I'll kick it off. Jennifer, great presentation. I just had a quick question. What is the cost benefit compared to other traditional storage options?
That's a very good question. Actually, don't have that number off the top of my head, but we'll look into that, and then that's something I'll get back to you.
Okay, and just one follow-up question. As far as the volume of storage, when we start to look at the volumes that go to the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie during these peak events, we're, in the Caloosahatchee, we see peak flows of 14,000 cubic feet per second. And when you start to look at, each well at 15 acre feet, which is what, 7.5 CFS, it takes a lot of wells and a lot of storage or flow equalization basins or whatever mechanism you use to store that water so that you can pump it into the well over time so that you can get that water for beneficial use at some point. So that's a concern when we look at these peak flows. Obviously, proximity to the lake is helpful. Closer you are to the lake, the more likely you can pull water from the lake and put those in the wells. But as you spread them across the landscape north of the lake or around the lake, you don't have that ability to pull from the lake. So it's something we need to consider. But I think it's important as we talk to the community about ASR wells, we have to explain what they will do and what they won't do. And I don't think that they're going to have a huge benefit to taking those peak flows to the estuaries off, but they could have benefits, during the dry season, feeding that water in for water supply, whether it's for environmental purposes or water supply for agriculture or urban water supply. I think there's some benefits there. But I think it's an important tool in the toolbox, but we need to make sure we're transparent to the public on what they will and won't do. Thanks.
That's a great point. Thanks. Bob Verastro here. Yeah, the ASR wells really were never intended to catch peak flows. One ASR well all by itself is 5 million gallons a day, 15 acre feet per day. The idea is that, and the way we've actually modeled ASR within the Lake Okeechobee Watershed Restoration Project, with the evaluation of the project in total, the 80 ASR wells would work in conjunction with the wetland attenuation feature, the impoundment feature, to actually work in sync together. And when we think about this first $50 million appropriation that the state's given us, we're really just thinking about a very small, incremental expansion or construction of the ASR systems. So if we actually can construct maybe 10 wells with the 50 million or with the first appropriation, those first 10 wells won't do much in the big picture of things, but 10 wells operating for maybe 6 months out of the year will actually store about as much water as 60% of the wetland attenuation feature. So for $50 million, we're getting 60% of the cost of a large surface water impoundment feature. And that's really the power of ASR, is that we do get storage without buying land, keeping land ownership unimpacted. So that's kind of one of the benefits that also ASR gives us. And that folds into the cost-benefit analysis, when we're actually talking about not having to acquire land to get the volume of storage that we can get simply by constructing the wells within our own already owned canal right-of-ways. That's a big leverage.
Gene, you had a...
Just on the cost benefit, comparing it, for example, to a shallow surface water storage reservoir, I don't know how you put a value on aquatic plants, invertebrates, macroinvertebrates, the wildlife, the ability the wildlife to use the area, the birds that would facilitate a surface water storage. When you're doing a cost-benefit analysis, the environment gets short shrift on those kinds of things because you can't really put a price tag on those kinds of things. We would have far better, I think, results with more shallow water, surface water impoundments than to pump the water underground. And as far as this committee, I heard, this is not the first committee. There was a Corps of Engineers on a water management district report. The title was Regional Ecological Risk Assessment of SERP Aquifer Storage and Recovery Implementation in South Florida. Just a few very quick excerpts. The effect of reproduction on Ceradaphnia, that's a water flea for non-biologists, was observed. The March 10th test showed statistically significant differences of 12.5%. The March 24th sample, 95.52%. In cycle 2, the effect of reproduction of the water fleas, 100%. Statistically significant differences in muscle for over a 28-day period of study, radium-226. In fish, arsenic accumulated in all fish tissues to an average concentration of 0.46 milligrams per kilogram, statistically significant. Arsenic increased in all treatment groups and statistically significantly higher. We've got nickel, molybdenum, arsenic. One of the most disturbing things about this study was in the stressor response hypothesis, the original hypothesis, if the water quality characteristics of the recovered water affect surface water quality at the pilot ASR projects in the near field environment and the Everglades, there is a potential for various effects of flora, fauna in these receiving waters. That was changed. The final report reads, water quality of the recovered water does not negatively affect surface water quality downstream of a point of discharge to the level where negative effects on the flora, fauna are measurable at the local or regional level. In other words, by the time the water gets down to Everglades National Park, it's going to be great. ASR really gives you not a very good bang for your buck. You'd be way better off spending your money on surface water, shallow surface water impoundments. You'll have biological uptake of nutrients, and you increase habitat for wildlife, fish, invertebrates, birds, all those kinds of things, which you just simply can't measure in a cost-benefit analysis done by some engineer. That's why the tribe is always opposed to ASR, and we're not going to drink the Kool-Aid. That's all. My message is we're not going to drink the Kool-Aid. We're not for ASR. You all will do it anyway, I know that, but we're not for it.
Gene, what was that you were reading from?
The report was called Regional Ecological Risk Assessment of SERP Aquifer Storage and Recovery Implementation in South Florida. It was published in September of 2014.
All right.
Just so that you're aware, Drew, that report is within the ASR regional study document that we actually had prepared and reviewed by the National Academy of Sciences.
Okay.
So we've heard that loud and clear. One of the actual recommendations of the National Academy of Sciences, after having reviewed those results, was that they recommended that we actually continue to try and do larger recovery cycles so we can actually statistically confirm what those results actually showed. And we certainly have every intention of doing those continued studies.
I appreciate that, Gene. Yeah, Lee.
Lee Hefty with Miami-Dade County. You mentioned pre-treatment. Generally, what does that look like?
Well, pretreatment is a couple of different things. When we are pumping into the well, what we don't want to do is clog the well. We don't want to plug up the transmissivity or the porosity within the aquifer itself. So the first level of treatment that we do is to filter the water. What we've done at a couple of different ASR systems is we've used mechanical screens. We've got an 80-micron screen that we constructed and operated successfully at the Hillsborough ASR system. At the Kissimmee ASR facility, we actually used a sand filter, a basic sand filter that also worked well. So that first level of treatment is for actual filtration. Then behind the filtration process, we actually disinfect the water to drinking water standards. And what we've done at both SERP ASR systems is we've used an aquionics ultraviolet system. So both of those processes, treatment, filtration, and disinfection, are essentially what we're looking at for the ASR systems. We actually are using a consultant, Stantec, to take a look at what other options are available. If there's something smarter and better that's come online in the last decade, we'll look hard at that. But it's probably going to be some combination of a filtration system and a disinfection process.
You'd mentioned some level of phosphorus sequestration. Is that significant?
Yeah, well, it is. It was something that was actually not quite anticipated when we cycle tested the Kissimmee ASR system. We did 4 successively larger cycles over a period of about 4 years. And the water that we pumped into the ASR well had phosphorus concentrations of between 50 and 150 parts per billion. When we recovered the water, the phosphorus concentrations were all less than 20. So we were not expecting to see something quite that substantial. So we are thinking right ahead of the game that we will want to take a good hard look at the capacity for the ASR system to do that. And it's not really anything new. I mean, limestone has an affinity for phosphorus. I mean, limestone is used to pull phosphorus out of water treatment systems for a long time now. So what we're trying to really answer the question of is it sustainable? Or is there an endpoint to, if the aquifer can reduce phosphorus, how long will that go on for?
Yeah, will it get saturated or not?
Yeah.
And in terms of arsenic, what level of arsenic were you ending up with in the water?
For the very first cycle that we conducted at the Kissimmee ASR system, we had like an initial concentration out of the ASR well of about 40 parts per billion, but that dropped off to less than 10 within a couple of weeks. And then with successive cycles, we saw a couple of spikes of arsenic, but really what we think we saw is that, where arsenic has been mobilized in ASR systems occasionally around the state is that it's highly treated drinking water is really the kind of water that is somewhat aggressive water. It actually wants to sorb metals out of the aquifer matrix. What we're thinking we actually saw with the SERP projects is that what we were pumping into the aquifer was very stable, very lightly treated surface water that's chock full of all the nutrients that it's got in it already. It's very stable water, so it didn't really look like it had a real want to take water or nutrients or metals out of the aquifer.
And do you think that pH is affecting that down in the aquifer?
We didn't see any effect of pH at all in terms of whether it was creating any sort of a reduction in either a buildup within the aquifer of any kind of a solid or not, and it certainly wasn't leaching water aquifer material out of it during the cycles that we conducted.
And I don't want to monopolize the discussion, but one more question. How stable in terms of the physical location of the bubble over time? Does it tend to move with any aquifer flow, or is it fairly well stabilized?
That's a wonderful question for a geologist. Some of the things that we really kind of, when we get into the realm of groundwater flow and groundwater velocity, it's really, really quite slow, right? I mean, the water that's in the aquifer right now in South Florida, it's between 10,000 and 20,000 years old. And that water, it took 10 or 20,000 years for that water to get from the recharge area up in Ocala all the way down to where it is now in South Florida. So the groundwater velocities are on the order of 0.001 foot per day. So, yeah, the bubble itself, once it's in place, it does become entrained in the groundwater flow realm, but it's really very slow.
Geologic scale?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that review. I think it was a good overview of the ASR technology. I would start by saying I'm not sure that the National Academy gave recommendations on how to implement it at a large scale. Unfortunately, you don't have to listen to my interpretation. You can read what they said in their press release, for example. They said, although uncertainties about ecological impacts are too great to justify near-term large-scale implementation of aquifer storage and recovery in the Everglades, ASR could be phased in to answer several important scientific questions. And I think they spelled out those scientific questions very, very clearly, along with a path to how to address them. For example, the question about long-term cumulative impacts. They recommended you do modeling over the entire time frame of the project, rather than just, the study looked at one kind of wetting and drying cycle or inflow and outflow cycle, but the entire simulation period, 40 years. At a regional scale, and then do local scale modeling to determine what the hydrogeology may look like, how it may respond. So they had a pathway to get there. What they were particularly concerned about was not so much the technology of ASR, but the application of taking surface water, putting it in the ground, and putting it back into surface water. That there were some real questions. They noted, for example, that because this is very rich, as you mentioned, biofouling may be an issue, and UV disinfection with very high total dissolved solids may or may not work. In fact, that was an issue. Arsenic, you mentioned arsenic. They said, yeah, it's true, arsenic concentrations went down, but that initial flush of arsenic was so high, it still may result in bioaccumulation in the biosphere. Effective sulfates and methylmercury, the methylization of mercury and sulfates, that whole cycle needs to be addressed. So I think what they said was, do the studies necessary to make a determination about the feasibility and likely application of ASR. And that makes complete sense. It's something I know as a scientist I can say, yeah, that I can't answer the question right now. I'll need more information about the application, particularly in these water quality impacts. So, while I think a panel is an excellent idea, but what I think what a predicate may be is the science plan that spells out how you're going to reduce the uncertainties that the National Academy spelled out. Because I encourage everyone to read the report. It's very clear, very easy to read. They make very specific recommendations. Some of these are field tests, some of these are lab tests, some of these are modeling, but it is a science plan that's necessary to implement. And then when you're done, you let the science determine whether or not this makes sense to move to the next step. So,
thanks, Tom. Sure. Now I'll go to CareCap.
Finally get to agree with something Dr. Van Lent says. Anyway, it's been a while.
Not that bad, Gene.
That is a pretty good summary of what they said. They did not recommend they go forward with full-scale ASR for absolutely, for sure. And I would just add that the reason we're talking about filtration and UV treatment is because something called trihalomethanes. Most of you in the room are not probably drinking water people, but people that have to treat drinking water, there's a disinfectant byproduct called THMs, trihalomethanes. It is mostly carcinogenic, and it occurs when you take organic rich water and treat it with either chlorine or bromine or one of the traditional drinking water treatment technologies. And that's the reason they're doing the filtration and the UV, because normal drinking water treatment, when you put it down in the ground and you pump it back out, your trihalomethanes go to an unacceptable level. So, you know, turning your drinking water aquifer into a carcinogenic source is not a great idea. But if you don't treat it, what have you got? You got pathogens. So you get a choice, you know, do you want pathogens or do you want carcinogens? You know. So, but I do agree that if you're going to treat it, use the UV treatment. It's more expensive, and you're probably going to find out in the volumes that you're trying to do it, it's not going to work. But stay away from chlorine and bromine treatment because you're going to end up with carcinogenic water.
Thanks, Jane. Mark?
Yeah, sorry, I was late. There was a, all stop on southbound 95 north of 45th Street, and I am not Kara Cap. Kara's asked me to fill in. She may have her baby here any minute, so we're excited about that. This following the ASR technology all through the review system and including the, the regional studies that were done, and Bob's and Jennifer have related to that. We started out with the comprehensive Everglades plan thinking about, 330 ASR wells, and the 200 ASR across the top of the lake, Lake Okeechobee ASR, was a big effort to try to do that. But the regional studies come back and say out of that 330, we probably 131 is all you can really afford to use, and probably out of those 200 across the top of the lake in that project, you could only get down to 78 or 80, and that's where this 80 comes from. The idea of that pre-treatment and post-treatment is really critical, and I watched the National Academy as they went through those discussions like Gene is iterating, and that is a real concern. And not only arsenic, but other compounds that deal with things are real concern, because when you recover that water and you put it back into surface waters and it becomes available for water supply or other things, then you have to be concerned of what you're doing, putting it into the aquifer, what it does down there, and then what it does when you recover it. The other point I want to make is that in the report, a lot of the hydrological conditions talk about, and I appreciate Jennifer's slides on this first couple of slides, simply showing that kind of graphic of these confining layers and the distinctions between the surface aquifer, the Floridan aquifer in the upper, the Avon Park, and then the lower Floridan. But the idea of those confining layers being perfectly level and perfectly dynamic to confine those layers is not really the case in a lot of our structure under Florida. In fact, in the reports it talks about there are faults, fractures, and karst collapse structures also identified in the upper Floridan of the Florida aquifer zone, so Floridian aquifer. So we're real concerned that when you put this water in, it's not going to stay there. And it moves and it migrates, and in fact, USGS has done a lot of studies in the deeper Floridan, the lower Floridan, where you inject water for underground injection wells, and we find that they migrate up to the upper Floridan, and we actually recover that within a couple of hours. So they've done some studies in South Florida that are really concerning, that there's this transmissivity, if you will, between these confining layers, and it's not so confining. So the question before was, how much do we recover? How much can we expect to recover? Some projects in the pilot projects, the Kissimmee looks really good. Others in Hillsborough, not so good. So it's going to really depend on what you do and where you put them to get kind of the recovery rates and volumes. The last thing is about the actual volume and the actual rates at which this is happening. You heard mentioned 15.3 acre feet per day per well. Well, that equates to about 7.7 cubic feet per second per well. So when you're talking about thousands of cubic feet per second being discharged to estuaries or trying to keep out of the lake in order to stop the harmful discharges to the coastal estuaries, and 7.7 CFS is not really comparable to what you do. So in looking at that storage over time, you say, well, we can do that and we'll be able to do it over time. And the concerning thing about the Lake Okeechobee Watershed project is that the 448,000 acre feet that's described there for storage as ASR using these 80 wells, that's pumping them 24/7, 365 days a year to get 448,000 acre-feet of storage. So I really caution us at considering, well, that's going to solve our storage problems up north of the lake. Let's just use ASR wherever we can. Okay, so I just try to make a couple of points there, but I appreciate the discussion. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, a couple items. In relation to the arsenic discussion that's going on, in the ASR regional study, they do indicate, this is published research from cycle testing at the Kissimmee ASR indicates that arsenic is released, but is subsequently precipitated in the aquifer during a single cycle test, such that nearly all recovered water in successive cycle tests is in regulatory compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. Is that accurate?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. So the arsenic is getting it's being pulled out on, sorry, you probably can't hear me. It's being pulled out on the first cycle test, or in the first few cycle tests, and as it goes back down, it gets precipitated, and then it's not coming back up in general. Is that correct?
Yeah. There are minerals in the rock matrix. It's actually pyrite. They're pyrite framboids in the rock matrix, and it's actually a tiny, tiny fraction of the mineralogy within the limestone of the aquifer. So when this fresh water, oxidized water, comes in contact with that mineral, the pyrite actually sort of leaches out some of its constituents, which is arsenic is one of those constituents of that mineral. So what we've seen over ASR systems that have experienced arsenic mobilization, typically what happens is that as cycle testing basically occurs, that mineral slowly but surely gets dissolved out and the arsenic concentrations decline over time. So that's the trends that we see.
Okay, good, thank you. In addition, I've seen that there's discussion on the estuaries, minimizing the estuary releases. Lately, there's been a lot of discussion about that. And in a district news release, they showed some of the modeling. It said that modeling shows northern reservoir and ASR storage reduces damaging estuary releases by 60%. So in the release, it says, when combined with other already authorized components, these recoverable water system options reduce the total discharge volume to the estuaries by more than 60%. So this the ASRs in combination with the northern reservoir could have a very substantial impact on the estuary discharges. Is that correct?
Yes, that's what we're aiming for.
Okay. All right. Okay, and last section here. And there's a little bit of discussion on the National Academies of Science. They say in one of their press releases, I think on 2015, says the ASR regional study significantly advances understanding of large-scale implementation of ASR in South Florida. The National Research Council report says, the committee agrees with the ASR regional study findings that no fatal flaws in ASR have been discovered. So they brought up some good critique and good questions on ASR, but I don't believe they've indicated that there are any fatal flaws in the system or how it's designed. So is that accurate?
Yeah, I do. I think it was a reasonable conclusion that, ASR will work to some capacity, just like an STA works to some capacity and reservoirs work to some capacity. I think with the ASR regional study, originally we looked at 333 wells that were in the Yellow Book, and we conducted groundwater models and calibrated them to the findings from the pilot project, and we ultimately ratcheted down the number of wells from 333 to about 130 wells, and that was based on a very rigorous three-dimensional groundwater model so that we would essentially not damage the aquifer or create upconing or saltwater intrusion or impact existing users or all that kind of thing. So we kind of feel like we're in the realm of what's reasonable for the aquifer, and those findings were then taken from the ASR regional study and integrated into the Lake Okeechobee Watershed Plan.
Okay.
And so what we're really looking at doing, like what Jennifer said, is going out and to some of those cluster locations that the Lake Okeechobee Watershed Plan identified, and going out and drilling the first few wells, so we can actually see what the capacity is of the Upper Floridan Aquifer is and the Avon Park Permeable Zone wells formation are at 2 different locations. And we'll do the mineralogical tests to figure out if there's pyrite in the formation, if there's a way that we can complete the well that is not within a zone that has pyrite. We'll take a look at doing that if we can. So, what we're planning on implementing is, a small incremental phase of well construction and testing, so that we can address those continuing uncertainties that the National Academy did identify. One of the frustrations that we had with the SERP projects is that we did have kind of limited time to be able to cycle test the wells and limited budget, and they were only a 1-well system. So one of the other findings from the National Academy is it was wonderful for you to test 1 ASR well, but what would be a more robust test would be testing a couple of ASR wells together and testing them for longer periods of time, so that you actually have a more robust understanding of what that recovered water will look like and what its ramifications will be in the ecosystem. So that's kind of one of the things that we're trying to bring forward is with these first few wells. We would like to test them for longer periods of time to really try to address the ecological risk assessment type questions that we're very well aware of.
Yeah, and I think that's important to remember is we're not building 300 wells or even 100 wells. We're building a few just to gather more data.
Mhm.
Right.
That's right.
All right, thank you.
There's my button. What's the capacity of the Kissimmee and the L63N wells?
The Kissimmee ASR system is 5 million gallons a day, which is 3,500 gallons a minute, or 8 CFS, more or less, or 15 acre-feet per day. I've had to run through the conversions multiple times in my own head. The L63N ASR well is a very high-capacity well, actually. It's completed in the Avon Park Permeable Zone. That could easily be like a 10 million gallon a day well, twice that of the Kissimmee ASR system.
So I was just going to comment, I think the notion of trying to have a standard design, so you're not having to go through design specs anytime you're doing this. I was just thinking if you could go from 5 to 6, it's a 20% increase. I assume it's not 20% more to build a 6 MGD well versus 5. So from a cost perspective, I think thinking about functional capacity, this is where you just give it to the engineers and what the heck, what can we design from a cost perspective? And obviously the points about James's point earlier about, wow, these are relatively small amounts of water, but I do think that, good heavens, if I'm experiencing pain, if I can reduce that pain even a little bit, I'm pretty happy. So estuaries experience pain with excessive freshwater flows, so any excessive flows that can be not discharged to the estuary, I think is a good idea. So I would just ask on the standardized design that you really give some thought to, is there an inflection point on the capacity of these wells so you're optimizing maximizing the benefit while not maximizing necessarily the cost, so keeping the cost constrained. And then finally, I'm not an ASR person at all, but I hear the arsenic. I just think arsenic's probably not a good thing. I'm familiar with injection wells, and so has there been any thought about co-locating one injection well for these network of ASRs? And there are a couple of reasons why you might do that. One, if the ASR well, for whatever reason, were not able to be operated. Maybe your strainer goes down, your UV system goes down. An injection well, we know, is a way to dispose of water without disposing that through an estuary. Again, from an estuary perspective, I think that's not a bad idea. The other one is, if you know or you're expecting, or science, good science is critical. I think everyone at the table would agree with the comments about let's be robust in the science. So if the science shows that on the first flush, on the first initial testing, whether it's the first time you test it or every time you begin the recovery, if you're having high arsenic, we could divert that if there was one injection well co-located with these networks and dispose of it down an injection well. And I'll remind people at the table that the leachate from the landfill, not far away from us, that's pretty nasty stuff. That gets thrown away in a deep injection well. Deep injection wells are used throughout Florida to dispose of some very nasty stuff. I'm not trying to create new policy. I'm trying to use existing policy as a means to address, if we know arsenic's a problem, if it's a problem for a narrow period of time or in a certain component of water, if you did have a co-located injection well, you could dispose of that arsenic there. And then conceivably, you wouldn't turn that injection well back on unless you're in a very high flow scenario. For some reason, you couldn't use your ASR wells and you could turn the injection well on to delete water out of the system. Thanks.
That's a very intriguing concept, Aubrey. Thank you for that. Hadn't considered that. You know, there are several ways that we can treat for arsenic if we have to, but I must admit that I had not thought of that concept of installing ASR systems with an injection well. That could be one way to address that.
Yes, Susan?
Yes, just curious, annualized cost to operate these wells, including the treatment and everything else you're going to have to do in a per acre foot or some kind of measure?
Well, when we operated the Kissimmee ASR system, which would be a 5 million gallon a day well, when we were actually pumping and treating all that time, it was a couple $100 a day in electrical costs and chemical costs during recharge. You know, like we've been talking about here with ASR, you're either recharging or storing or recovering. So there's 3 different modes of operation for an ASR well, and a lot depends on what the climactic conditions would be, what the level of Lake Okeechobee could be. If we're recharging into the well, then we're going to have those costs for operating and electrical to be able to, and monitoring to be able to pump into the well, and it'll be along those kind of numbers. During storage, there's nothing happening. In terms of the system is basically turned off. So there's very little in the way of electrical or operating costs during storage. When we're recovering, what we're looking at is actually, we're going to look real hard at letting the natural artesian head of the aquifer give us the water back by its own force. So if we can recover the water using the natural artesian flow from the formation, then we'll have very, very little electrical costs for recovery also. So it's really during that recharge phase where all the filters are working, the UV system is working, the pumps are injecting and pumping the water is really the intensive part of it all. And that all depends on how long the lake is unacceptably high, or we're having high discharge to the estuaries. That'll be dictating the length of that recharge period.
It would be nice to see this compared to other surface water type storage, such as dispersed water, because I realize that we do pay the landowners for their dispersed water projects. It would be nice to see that, because an initial cost is one thing, but annualized cost, including staff and everything else, you know, you've really got to look at that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's another reason why, to Aubrey's thing, we're trying to actually be conscious of what our O&M staff is going to have to deal with when we consider actually, constructing what could be up to 80 of these wells. We want to make sure that whatever we're using for them has something of a standardized look, so that when our guys go out there to try to operate these things, they know what they're looking at and doing that. So that's all part of the engineering design that we're undertaking right now.
So I know that when the Corps does their PIRs and everything, they do cost analysis because they have to determine it's feasible. So we'll try to extract those out of the PIR, tentatively selected plan, whatever you call it, and get it on the website. Yeah, James?
I just wanted to revisit the benefits to the estuaries, and I know it was stated earlier that there was a 60% benefit from the Lake Okeechobee Water Restoration Plan, and based on the PIR EIS, it says the optimized TSP would reduce the total flows to the northern estuaries by 30% when compared to the future without conditions. So it's important to note that I believe it was an 80% benefit when you combine it with all of the other projects. But I believe the Clusatchee was somewhere around a 17% benefit for that project. So it's important to know it's a 30%, not a 60%. So I think it does provide some benefits, but they're incremental with all the other projects.
Yeah, Mark?
Just to kind of iterate, and I'm all about not having discharges go to the northern estuaries, of course, and part of the whole discussion and why we have a watershed protection plan is in the northern system is to help prevent the lake from coming to that point where it has to discharge. I wish we could do a lot more in this project. The Lake Okeechobee watershed project, to me, needs to be all the way up into the 2.6 million acres north of the lake and not just confined to the lower part of the Kissimmee, which comes into the lake. But be that as it may, the ASR portion of that, again, this exploratory kind of idea and setting up kind of another pilot project study is good, and in a way to find out more data and more information so we can base decisions on going forward or not with ASR. But it's the idea too that, in the ASR study, when the regional study, part of when they reduced the planning for those number of wells from the 330 down to the 134, they also considered about 101 wells in the boulder zone or the deep injection wells. And they stated in there that the construction of those 101 boulder zone wells is unlikely because water is needed at the surface. And I want everybody to take a real note of that in ASR, when we looked at the regional study, we said, injecting water down and disposing of water, surface water, back into the lower Florida and then just trying to get rid of it is not really a good idea. It doesn't have anything to do with Everglades restoration, doesn't have anything to do with restoring the watershed. So we really got to be cautious as much as we might want to think, well, let's just inject it and get rid of it. It's not going to be in that system, that we need it at the surface. We need it at the surface because the surface water is going to have to recharge other aquifers, which we depend on. And the upper Floridan has to be that consideration, along with even the Biscayne. We want that water to flow, obviously, south to recharge Biscayne. But in the upper Floridan, we're depending more and more in our water supply plans in the upper East Coast and other water supply plans for that upper Floridan to be the primary producer of our drinking water. And the more we jeopardize that by injecting or recovering and ASR kind of stuff, we got to be really, really cautious and careful how that affects the regional system. And I think that's part of what National Academy was concerned about, is how are these ASR projects going to really affect the regional water systems that we depend more and more on. We're getting away from the superficial aquifer. It's just overloaded and not recovering from rainfall, so we're depending more and more on the upper Florida and pulling it out, putting it through our RO process and using it as our drinking water. And it's a real concern, and I'm totally not in favor of really disposing of it and putting it down into a boulder zone, hoping it goes away, and that was confirmed in the regional study. Thanks.
Thanks. Tom?
I have a question, and this is kind of getting to the regulatory framework. I understand that the regulatory standards for ASR are primarily drinking water standards because that's the primary application of ASR is drinking water, so that makes some sense. But I also think I recall that there was exemptions for color and iron, if I'm not mistaken. So my question is, will you be asking for any exemptions from any of the standards, primary or secondary drinking water standards, for any of the wells?
Right. So when we're pumping water into the upper part of the Floridan aquifer, it's designated as an underground source of drinking water. And the criteria for being able to put water into that kind of an aquifer system is that you have to meet primary drinking water standards, which puts us into the mode of filtrating the water and disinfecting the water. Then there are secondary standards, and those are aesthetic standards, such as color, which is not really a health-based standard, but it's an aesthetic kind of standard, or odor of the water is an aesthetic standard. Those are things like secondary drinking water standards. So what we were able to do at the ASR pilot projects is we were able to apply for exemptions for having to meet an aesthetic standard, like color and iron. I think odor has been used in the past for aesthetic standards. And previously, the DEP has given us exemptions for those kinds of standards. They're really wanting to make sure we meet primary drinking water standards, which are health-based drinking water standards.
I mean, I haven't heard about that yet, so that's something that I'm going to take that as feedback for consideration. Yeah, thanks. Jackie? Yeah, sure, of course.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jackie Thurlow-Lippish. I'm a member of the governing board. I wasn't expecting to be sitting up here today, but thank you for allowing me to. Before I say anything, Aubrey, I have to say that I was recently looking at these videos of the Kissimmee River restoration, and you were in one of them, and you were probably like 20. So I was like, oh my gosh. So I wanted to say something nice before I might say something that's against what you just said. I just think we should all remember that when the new board came in, we did not support the deep injection wells or the estuary protection wells. And it's a very controversial subject. It's hard for people to understand. My feeling, and I'm not speaking for the board, of course, is just that if we want the ASRs to be successful, it's probably good to focus on them first. Just because I think if you start mixing and matching, the whole thing might blow up. Most of us aren't scientists, and we have to remember that this is driven by taxpayers and regular, everyday people. So maybe I'm wrong, but I just thought it was important to say that, because this is a big deal. This is an incredible thing that we're all sitting around the table, that you are talking about this. And I think if it works, it can be the beginning of coming together, you know, for the EAA reservoir and the things that have happened over the past year, but it's still in a very fragile position. So I would not talk about deep well injection.
I certainly appreciate that, but I'm a big fan of vigorous debate on ideas, realizing that none of us hold the source of all true knowledge, right? We're all helping each other think through things. And I know for a fact, from a technical perspective, that injection wells are used to solve critical problems that are driven and associated with water. And sometimes, if we knowingly take tools out of our toolbox and leave them aside when we're trying to solve complex problems, we find ourselves unable to get to some desired endpoint. So the politics aren't the point that I'm the best at, but I think the science and critical thinking are things that I'm fairly decent at. And I know that just taking a valuable tool that's proven itself very, very functional in many applications and leaving that aside for political reasons, surely for political reasons, that gets done, and that's way above my pay grade. But at the technical level, I hate to just abandon a tool for political reasons.
Thanks. And your business is directly tied to these things. You know about these things. But when you're a teacher, you try to teach the first thing before you build on top of anything else. So I'm just saying, I just wanted to share today. So I'm sure this will go long beyond the couple of years that we're talking about. Thanks.
I mean, as you were talking about that, I put in my mind, we've got to figure out how to address water that comes up that's high in arsenic. What do we do with it, right? Is it, so, I mean, you raised one option, but there are other options. So what do we do with that, right? Very good.
So I have a kind of more of a 30,000 feet question, because I'm a social scientist by training, which I know is odd and possibly dirty in this particular scenario. But I need to understand the methodological trajectory here. How did we arrive at this particular point? What is the philosophical framework? So why is now the right time for this particular tool, and why are we putting energy at this particular moment into this particular method? Because for me, it feels like a fait accompli, and it also feels a little abrupt, and part of that is my own personal my personal involvement in this. And before I have you answer that, I do want to say, I agree with Gene that we need to put more emphasis on trying to understand the value, the inherent value of wildlife, of the natural services, not necessarily the ecological services as they benefit us. And there are some economic geographers who are doing really brilliant work on doing just that, looking at the bequest value, the inherent value, and coming up with really great ways for us to try to get there. And I think it's important to always include those. But that's an aside. I mean, the philosophical trajectory and the methodological trajectory, I think, will really help me understand how we got here.
Yeah, let me handle that. So I mean, it started way back when SERP was being developed, right? And so leading up to basically the approval and adoption of SERP in 2000, ASR Wells was adopted as part of that framework. And so it has been on the table since then. That's why there's the pilot studies, things like that. And then with the recent events about estuary discharges and the real public concern that we've experienced recently about that, there's been a lot of effort put into the implementation of SERP, the implementation of the EAA reservoir, the C43, C44 reservoirs. And so all of that's going, we're getting money to do all of these things. And then last year, we got money to do Lake Watershed. And so it was a decision at the legislature to put in $50 million for Lake Watershed implementation. And then they engaged us about putting it forward, getting it down. They attended board meetings about get this ASR going. And they continue to talk to me about it. And so it was really prudent for the district to figure out, okay, there's interest, there's appropriations, there's expectation. How do we go about, embracing what we know and what we don't know to put together a process to start to put ASR to work in a safe way, in a systematic way. And I think, the staff has done a good job sort of laying out how we try to create the assurances on safety for the environment and for public and that kind of stuff as we execute that appropriation. And so the first step, really was bringing this together. And we've heard a lot of good information. Okay, there's these concerns. We've got to figure out how to address those, talk about those. And so I just envision this as, okay, we've got direction. We need to go execute this direction, but let's do it in a very public, engaging, and systematic way that addresses the concerns we hear about the technology. So that's kind of the evolution of it.
Hey, Drew, just one last point about the independent external peer review, I think is a good program, and I might suggest you consider Dr. Sydney Backus. She's in University of Georgia, a geologist, and has written papers on flow paths and flowways in ASR technology in 2000 in the journal Geophysical Sciences, 2015, and also Dr. Hal Wanless. He's the chair of the Department of Geology in University of Miami and has been involved and engaged with a lot of seminars and workshops that have done around the state for many years on this particular subject. So those two I would ask you to consider for you.
Just one brief comment to add about, Drew, your response about why we're doing this, but to put a little bit into perspective, there's 3.45 million acres coming into, runoff coming into Lake Okeechobee. The lake itself is 730 square miles, and one average foot off the lake is 450,000 acre feet. So when you put that into perspective, and I've always been a supporter of rehydrating the landscape where we can collaboratively with landowners, and I think we need to continue to do that. But when you look at those numbers of volumes and what it would take with the lake the size it is to put that much back on the landscape and shallow, it's pretty daunting, if not impossible. So I think the tools of ASR wells, where we're conserving water, getting good recovery versus releases to the estuary, has to be, and that's why it's a part of the plan. Needs to be a part of the plan. But I don't think that means we stop doing some of the other approaches and methodologies. I think it's just like everyone said here, it's not one solution, it's a combination of solutions.
All right, Doug, yeah.
So this is a great discussion, and I appreciate the presentation. And as a non-scientist, the word I keep hearing is uncertainty, uncertainty, uncertainty. Uncertainty about recharge and recovery rates, uncertainty about ecological impacts from recovered water. I'm still not sure if I completely understand the recycle and arsenic issue in terms of what happens to water that's got 40 parts per billion of arsenic in it in that initial flushing, I think was the word that's used. Where does that water go, and what's the ecological impact from water that may be laden with arsenic? I'm still not sure I'm completely clear on that. But it doesn't, as a non-scientist, it doesn't sound good. The importance of storage and treatment of water north of the lake in this gigantic watershed is critical. And, we started out this discussion with a question about cost-benefit analysis. And, Mark went through the progression of SERP called for 333 wells with, I think, 1.7 billion gallons of capacity a day, to 130 to 80. And now with the uncertainties raised by the NAS review, maybe it's not 80. Maybe it's 40, maybe it's 50 when you start to, find out more information as you conduct these pilots and try to gather more information and answer some of these critical questions. And that then leads to a recalculation of, well, what if it does project out to be 40 or 50 as opposed to 80? Now it's a recalculation of the benefit versus the cost again. So I'll just end with, I keep coming back to this issue of uncertainty. And so I would say proceed with caution and, with these pilots, and we really have to answer these questions. They are critical questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Doug.
Rebecca Elliott, and I just wanted to remind people that SERP used ASR in a couple of instances that no other storage could deal with. One is to be able to take water when everything else is full, when the surface water reservoir can't do it. And the other thing was to be able to give water when everything else was dry. So the water budget that SERP had really relied on ASR to make it all work for both the natural systems that were going to need water during the dry times and other water-related needs. And again, there's a lot of work to be done. But I feel like when you look at it system-wide, and as being on Recover leadership group, we've looked at this a lot, and I've gone through a couple of studies to look at what happens. ASR is really a critical tool to make it work.
No pressure.
Thanks. Yeah, Gene.
One final thought on this idea of certainty. When I came out of the Army, I went to work for U.S. Geological Survey. I worked for a guy named Aaron Hager. I think a lot of you guys probably know Aaron. He was a brilliant man. we talked about ASR. And he told me, Gene, take a look at a pane of glass, a window, when it's raining, and you see that drop of water sitting there. And then a little trickle comes down, and that water gets bigger, and it gets a little bigger. And then pretty soon, the next little minuscule little bit of water hits that thing, and what does it do? It runs away. And that's what subsurface geology in Florida is like. You can put water down, and it just doesn't appear to be moving. Maybe on a geologic scale, as you said, it just doesn't appear to be moving. But the more you put that thing in there, the more you keep dumping it in, just like Aaron told me. One of these days, you're going to go to pump it out, and it ain't going to be there. Because subsurface geology is not that predictable. So I wouldn't put too much hope on certainty. I think that was the word that was used. I don't use that word in subsurface geology. There's not that much certainty, in my opinion.
Thanks, Gene. If there's nothing else up here, I may go to public comment and then bring it back to the table. There wasn't a sign up for comment cards or anything. I've seen some interest in doing some public comments, and so just signal to me if you want to make some comments, and there'll be a 3 minutes. And so, yes, I saw you signal first. So come on up. Yep.
Many times, and we're all pretty smart people. I've heard a lot of things like, we don't know how much it's going to cost, if it works, that's what we're going to shoot for. What are we going to do with the poisons and the carcinogens? You know, we're all smart people. We're all concerned people, but we're representing 8.7 million people. We've got a responsibility. I get paid zip for doing this, by the way, and I've been here many times, so we'll take that off the table right away. Albert Einstein, pretty smart dude, says we cannot solve a problem using the same thinking that got us into the problem. We're still using the same thinking. I haven't heard one word other than the word teacher about educating. I would much sooner, and there's a cliche that every one of us have heard, I'd much sooner 1% of 100 people's efforts than 100% of one person's efforts. Imagine what 8.7 million people's efforts would do. That's the area that we're responsible for, that we're governing, all right? Now, to educate those people, there's ways to educate those people for pennies per person. We're talking billions of dollars to do more of the same thinking. We're trying to give people more water and get rid of more gray water with no emphasis, no infrastructure, and no budget to re-educate people. You know, the national average is 176 gallons per person per day. California right now is doing a pretty good job. They're around 60. I've sat with engineers locally in a well-known city, and I'm not going to point fingers, but a well-known city locally here, it's 320. That's insanity. It's so far from sustainable. One of the things I learned here today, and I've been studying this passionately for 10 years, and sat in conferences like this all over the world. We've got empty aquifers that took 10 to 20,000 years to create. We've sucked those things dry in our lifespan, in one lifespan. You know, one of my heroes is Jane Goodall. She says one of the most disturbing things in this society, she says she's seen the teenagers go from angry to despondent because they've realized that our parents have screwed up their future, and now there's nothing they can do about it. You know, in that same period of time, the suicide rate of those same teenagers is doubled. It's insanity. We are doing more of the same and expecting different results, which is the definition of, again, insanity. Please allow me to show all of us how for pennies per person, we can make a change through education. It's all about educating. It's about using different thinking. Everybody wants to be part of the solution. We're not letting them do that. We're not showing them how. I've sat in here, and I'm a pretty smart dude. All right, I've won global awards for what I'm doing. Forget about it. It's not significant. The issue is that it's pretty difficult to understand what we're trying to do, what we're shooting for, what we're hoping might happen, what might magically happen to the carcinogens. You know, it's insanity. We're spending billions of dollars trying to give more water and get rid of more poison water. Let's teach people to do more with less. I believe I've got the solution. It's educational. It costs pennies. And the last quick thing, I know I'm all out of time.
Yeah, you are.
There's many people that work for this organization. To my knowledge, and I've heard from other of the 5 water agencies here, there's 2 people in this organization that are focused, and their job is on conservation. Everybody else is trying to come up with more. That's what I've got.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Let me get to the, oh, you want to do a public comment, Newton?
I think everybody here knows I'm pretty brave. Follow you, sir.
Forgive me if I'm passionate. I get goosebumps.
Let me tell you, there's a lot of people here who have a lot of passion for over 20 years.
I'm not angry,
and
I'm just passionate.
But after you've been drugged through 20 years of it, you get a little bit slower. All right, I just want to say a couple of things. First, I spoke at ASR from the day that they were proposed. There was about 350 of them in the original SERP or Yellow Book or whatever. Always had the same questions everybody answered here today. I ask you today: arsenic, cost versus return. We all know that. We're just redoing what over and over again. Here's a little fact. If you are interested in saving the estuaries, 300 ASR wells will take 100 days to take 1 foot off the lake. In other words, they're not going to do a damn thing for the estuaries. ASR wells are just like a reservoir. They're to take the water when it's coming in slowly during the wet season, to store that water so that it will be available for the dry season. Absolutely no use much for the estuaries. They're too slow. He's right. Deep injection wells, 300 of those, will take 9,000 CFS out of the Kissimmee River. Do you know what the highest number of CFS that the Corps sends out to St. Lucie and the Caloosahatchee? 6,000 to the Caloosahatchee, 3,000 to the St. Lucie. If you want to stop the discharges to the estuaries, you have to take the water out of the system north of the lake, equivalent to the water that the Corps is now blowing out the estuaries. It's the only way. Now, last week I went to 2 meetings. The one in the morning, the district, it's on quality, it's on compliance to the consent decree. What an incredible story. That even with SERP not even halfway done, we're already meeting the 10 parts per billion phosphorus at the Tamiami Trail. Right now, WCA3 is full of water at less than 10 parts per billion phosphorus, ready to go into the park. Can't go into the park over 6,000 CFS because of Cape Sable Seaside Sparrow. The second.
You got 6 seconds.
Second, U.S. Corps of Engineer meeting was on quantity. I was shocked to find out, after being told for years 18,000 CFS would go under the trail when Mild Waters and COP was done. We were told it would be 13,000 CFS, max, if you disregard the bird. Not a bit of relief for the estuaries. Water comes into the lake between 18,000 and 30,000 CFS. 18,000 January 2016, 30,000 Irma. You cannot save the estuaries by putting 13,000 CFS on the trail. We have some real problems with that. Thank you.
All right, we're going to sort of form a line here if you want to make one. I see you, Ronaldo.
Raymond Iglesias, Anglers for Lake Okeechobee. 20 years, Newton mentioned this. C43 and ASR were identified in the SERP 20 years ago, and here we are still talking about it. It's time to act. ASR is not new technology. Tampa, Peace River, Marco Lakes, Collier County. ASR wells exist, they're utilizing them for drinking water, and it's time to move forward. The C-43 is being built in LaBelle to store 174,000 acre-feet of water that has zero benefit to Lake Okeechobee. If we can build for $100 million less, 80 wells north of the lake, and store 2.5 times the amount of water, and that's what we're here about today, right? Storing water, discharges, not Lake Okeechobee discharges because it's not our water, but they're northern watershed discharges. This is going to help. It's not going to be a silver bullet, but it is part of the solution. So we encourage you, Anglers for Lake Okeechobee encourages ASR, and we would like to start that soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Ronaldo with Lake Worth Waterkeeper. ASR wells, they're not a new technology. That's a good way to put it. But, so where carburetors existed at one point, and then we moved on from that technology. SERP is a great plan. I studied it for a long time, since law school. There's so many projects in it that are just critical to meet its goal. Everglades restoration, it's in the name. And since it's been signed, we've learned a lot about ASR wells. And what we've learned is, like Socrates once said, all I know is that I know nothing. That I think applies here. The level of uncertainty that like Dr. Van Lent pointed out, Mark and Doug, and it's just unacceptable. And it's quite an experiment to run a field experiment of this caliber in our aquifer, in our water source, claiming that there's no communication between the layers when we know that happens. And like Gene said, there's a lot of uncertainty just in how the water moves underground. So, this isn't a sealed lab devoid of repercussions. There can be some serious consequences further down the road in this. And just because we already have ASR wells in existence is not a good argument that we should move on with more. We should be moving back towards our goal of Everglades restoration. We know it works. Gene made a really good point early on about the value of a shallow wetlands and like the birds and the fish. That's a difficult thing to value. To me, it's basically priceless, but we really should be moving towards that. That should be the focus. That was the intention of SERP. And since then, we know that ASR wells, with the uncertainty, it's just not, the ROI is just not there when it's compared to something like an artificial shallow wetland, an STA, and so on. Those are the things that work. Those are the things we need to focus on. And when we spend more time and resources discussing and talking a dated technology, what we're really doing is we're pulling those resources and that time and effort from the stuff that we know works and what we should be doing. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Tom Walker, the Executive Director of the Florida Keys Aqueduct Authority. We're considered by the American Water Works Association to be a large provider of drinking water to our community. Yet, we're only pumping on a good day about 20 million gallons a day. We have the capacity to pump through our 3 treatment plants about 30 million gallons a day. I'm hearing numbers today of 400 million gallons a day of treatment. You're going to have to become a utility the size of Miami-Dade to be able to logistically, operationally provide treatment for these wells. I'm hearing you may want to do a cookie cutter. Every well has a treatment plant. You want 80 treatment plants. If you try to bring them together, a lot of pipelines, a lot of pump stations to bring them into central treatment plants. This is a consequential scope creep of grand scale. You've started from putting some holes in the ground to pump water downstairs, and now it's turned into a huge utility. I think you need to look back at what the whole picture looks like. I heard something earlier today that this is in the realm of reality, these numbers we're hearing. Well, actually, you're going to be changing reality. You're putting in 400 million gallons into a place that hasn't seen that kind of water at those velocities and volumes, probably in its lifetime. So I just wanted you to hear the perspective from somebody who runs a utility that's nowhere near the size of what you're talking about, but it is considered by AWWA to be a large utility in the United States. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Barbara Maidema. I'm president of Terra Rio Consulting. I had the pleasure of working on Everglades restoration for the last 25 years or so. I was on a charter member of WRAC and sat on WRAC until through 2018. And I've heard numerous reports on ASR Wells over the years with much attention. When SERP was passed, there was uncertainty. It was considered new technology. That's why Congress directed the Corps and the district to undertake a pilot project because it had unanswered questions. Fast forward, in 2015, WRAC had a comprehensive presentation. Dean Powell, who is now deceased, made that presentation, and it showed the results of the Kissimmee River, the Hillsborough, and Site 1. And Kissimmee was by far the best location. The location at Lake Hippachee, the geology wasn't right, so it is site-specific. The way that you're moving forward with the money that the legislature has given you, I think makes perfect sense. Bob Verasco did an excellent job of summarizing the findings of the regional study. Rebecca Elliott with FDACS gave you the reason that there was such a heavy reliance on ASR in SERP to begin with. It was a way to store water when nothing else would work and retrieve water when no other features would work. So kudos to you for moving forward with this, with all of the cautions that you've put around this program. So thanks, Drew. I appreciate everything that you do.
Good morning. I just had a quick question. I definitely don't have a lot of education on ASR, but are we expanding this to different industry, like for using it for maybe domestic wastewater? I know with the ocean outfall mandate, a lot more domestic wastewater facilities have a reclaimed requirement a lot in consumptive use permits, and can we more apply that to nutrient control there in addition to what we're doing with Okeechobee Watershed?
Tell you what, we'll get with you after the meeting. Will you stick around?
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. We can educate you on all that.
Thank you.
Morning, Mike Collins. I was in the room when this was first proposed by the Army Corps of Engineers, and I think we all need to keep in mind the fact it was proposed because no other combination of ingredients provided sufficient water to restore the Everglades. Some of the same comments that we heard that day 25 plus years ago, they're still the same ones I'm hearing today. If anyone out here is going to insist on certainty in any natural system or in human endeavor, all they're going to accomplish is making sure that nothing ever happens. Certainty is not within our grasp. Since that day, there have been 2 major scientific studies. There have been numerous pilot projects. There have been decades of monitoring of the potential impacts. I would submit that the district has historically and does to this very minute use a sufficient amount of science, caution, and accountability in the way they proceeded on this. If anything, there's been a massive overdose of caution in how we proceeded. This isn't new technology, and to pew that as, well, that's not good enough. That is good enough, because that's all you're going to have. It's the certainty that you have done, good science. Regarding the role of the NAS and science in general, I think we got a little different, sort of view on this. Their role is not to tell us that it's time to proceed. That's a policy decision. That recommendation is made by the executive staff sitting up here to the governing board, the legislature, and all the policy bodies that are involved. What NAS does is tell you how to get to the point where you have enough science. This is what you should consider in making that decision in terms of science. They've done it repeatedly. There's a little bit of a dynamic tension that goes on between science and policy. It's always been there. Early on in this process, at a meeting in Washington, NAS proposed to review the district budget to see if the district was going to spend enough money on this. That lasted for about 10 seconds until somebody got a hoof on it and told them to sit down. That tension's always going to be there. But the idea that the district has not and is not using a sufficient amount of science is something I'm just going to tell you. I've watched this very closely for many years. I'm as big a critic of this organization as ever set foot on the earth. And I'm going to tell you, you have been prudent, you've been wise, And it is time to start thinking about the resource instead of people's philosophies and concerns. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Scott Martin, professional angler, and live on Lake Okeechobee. You know, we've been as well coming to these meetings talking about ASR Wells now for several years, and I fully support the ASR Well project, fully behind that. Science does support it. There's obviously tons of evidence that it works great in the state for lots of applications, and I think I fully support it. I know the anglers do as well. But one added benefit that I wanted to bring up to everybody, just because as an angler, as a fisherman on Lake Okeechobee, aquatic vegetation is so important to me. It's the life of tourism. It's the life to the fish, and it's the key to clean our water. I mean, that's what the STAs are full of. That's what all of our marshes, the Everglades is full of. Grass cleans the water. And living on Lake Okeechobee as a kid, we used to have submerged vegetation that would grow a mile out in the lake, all around the lake. Water levels were between 12.5 and 15 foot, but we had, I would say, 80,000 acres of submerged vegetation. Last year we had 5. And we have all these increased issues on the coast with outbreaks and blooms and different things going on. But when we have water leaving the lake that's completely unfiltered, 5,000 acres is 0 submerged vegetation, by the way. That's a major issue. One of the advantages to these ASR wells, you talk about taking 1 foot of feet of water out of the lake. That 1 foot is what usually will kill the grass on Lake Okeechobee or allow it to flourish. If we have a Lake Okeechobee that's a 16 and 17 foot lake, it kills all of the vegetation in the lake, thus get back down to 0 vegetation. Right now, fortunately, we have, and I don't know if anybody here can back me up on this, but I know that we have at least 24,000 acres of submerged vegetation, but I would venture to say, just because I'm on it lately, I've seen the growth, I'm going to say we're at 30,000 right now. That's just my opinion, but I think I'm right. And that water is being filtered every single day. The great thing about Lake Okeechobee is it's round, and when the wind blows and there's submerged vegetation, that grass filters the water every single day for free. Not $100 a day, there's no power, there's no people managing it. The water pushes into the marsh and comes out. So we have to keep Lake Okeechobee at a very acceptable level, and these ASR wells are going to allow that lake to stay at an acceptable level for the submerged vegetation to grow, and that is going to increase our water quality all around every day of the week for free. So that's my vote for ASR wells. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to bring it back to the table. I know, just want to make sure everyone had a chance to share their thoughts. I don't know, Mr. Rayburn or LaPratt, or Johns, Haishu, any thoughts you want to share? You don't have to. Okay. All right, any other thoughts around the table before we, yes, sir.
Inger Hansen with DEP. I just wanted to say that the department has actually been working closely with the Water Management District on putting this pilot or incremental step forward on the pilot testing. We've been supportive of that this far. And we just started the permitting process, and as part of our responsibilities, we actually have a regulatory program that will go through and look at the underground injection control permits that's required. When we get a little bit further into this, we will also have NPDES permits. All of this is overlooked by EPA, and it's a pretty rigorous regulations that's associated with it. And it's also a lot of monitoring, treatment, things like that. So I think the approach that's being proposed here to do a smaller scale test and monitor it very carefully makes sense to me, at least. And I just wanted to put that forward before we end this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Inger. Yes, James.
Thank you, Drew.
Drew, thank you for putting us on the agenda today. I think it's good to get this all out in the open for the table for the members. I'd also say your team in the background, Bob and his team members have worked real close with us over at FWC on some of the aquatic ecology components of this that have been brought up. So I'm really encouraged that you're taking that component of the National Academy's recommendations very seriously moving forward. It's very good to see that. And as you implement these wells and do that exploration, that's going to be important. Now, you also, your presenters also mentioned the peer review panel. And I heard hydrologists, and I heard hydrologists and engineers and things like that on the peer review panel. I hope we'll have some wetlands ecologists or aquatic ecologists on that panel as well. And I assume there will be, but it's worth mentioning.
Are you volunteering?
It might be beyond the scope of my depth of knowledge on this, but I can find some recommendations if you're looking for them.
Okay. Thanks, James. All right. Well, I appreciate this. It's been very informative for me. I appreciate everyone's comments, everyone that weighed in. It's very helpful as we look at this endeavor. I know that we have another meeting in May 28th. As issues pop up at the district, as we grapple with issues that are important to the public, I may consider pulling this group back together before then, but we'll certainly be in touch if any of these issues need this kind of feedback, because this has been extremely valuable for me and for district staff to really hear people out, explore issues, that kind of thing. So right now, make sure you have, is it May 28th? May 28th on your calendars, but don't be surprised if I say, hey, let's get together and talk about a different issue at some point sooner than then. I don't know if I will, but just in case, you're forewarned, all right? Okay, well, appreciate everyone making the trip. I will call this meeting adjourned. Thank you so much.